in the wellness world, how there's a lot of stigma about medication and antidepressant medication. And what are I mean, obviously you're a psychiatrist and you give drugs, but what do you think about people who come in and they might be deeply spiritual and for some reason they're holding on to this idea like, I shouldn't need that, I shouldn't need that. What do you say to them or anyone listening?
I've seen a lot of that because of my Buddhist background, a lot of Buddhist teachers, people with a lot of experience with meditation who have hoped that that would be enough to cure their anxiety, their depression, their panic, whatever. They trust me, so they come to me, a little bit ashamed that the meditation hasn't done the trick and that they might actually need something else. So what I think is that there's a real human tendency to set whatever it is, Prozac or psychoanalysis or mindfulness or yoga, to set the one thing up as the panacea that's going to cure everything. And there's no one thing that can cure everything. So we're bound to be disappointed. And then when we get disappointed with the one thing, we turn on it, So the antidepressants, they're good for some kinds of depression. They really help some kinds of depression. They don't cure everything, and they give a lot of side effects. If you don't need them, then they just get in the way, So there was a period where, everyone wanted Prozac until, 80% of the people who tried it didn't do anything for.
Yeah.
And I'm a little worried in the wellness world, not just with the anti-medication prejudice, but that mindfulness, which is now being embraced, is not going to cure everything either.
Yeah.
So then people are going to turn against mindfulness, and losing what it's good for, not bothering to try to find what it's good for. So I try to find the middle ground in all of this for people.
Yes. Mark, you say our identities are coalesced around our traumas. Can you talk to us a bit about that?
Yeah. Well, trauma is a whole concept that has come into vogue. We've had it since the First World War, since soldiers who were obviously traumatized in the war started showing symptoms. And then this idea of post-traumatic stress, we became something that people could identify as a real thing, a real syndrome. But in the Buddha's time, 2,500 years ago, they didn't have the word trauma. But the Buddha, when he gave his first psychological teachings, he gave them in the form of the Four Noble Truths. The first truth, which is his diagnosis of the problem, he just used a single word, which was dukkha, as, there's a reality to our lives, which is dukkha, he said. And dukkha is ordinarily translated as suffering. So then the Buddhism got a bad name by saying like life is suffering, and so, where's the happiness? And, is the Buddha denying happiness? No. But the word dukkha, if you take it apart, it actually means hard to face. The Buddha was saying there's always an aspect to life that's hard to face. Ka is face. Dukkha is hard to face. Sukha is like sweet to face. So that's the Sanskrit word for happiness or joy or sweetness, So what the Buddha is talking about trauma, I think, by saying that old age, illness, death, separation, loss, illness, there's even in a blessed life, we have to face those things at some point. And so the reality of it is always running like an underground river, like we're always a little looking off to the side, like, wary of what might come. Now with COVID, we're in the middle of a like worldwide thing that's hard to face. But so I would call all of that trauma. From the psychological world, the Western psychological world, they talk about big T trauma, which is like war, earthquakes, tsunami, terrorism, fires, terrible things that happen to people. Big T trauma, where you get post-traumatic stress. But then they also talk about little t traumas, which the other word for that is developmental trauma. Uh, Things that happen when we're young, or things that didn't happen when we're young, but maybe should have happened, an absence that was there, like if your parents were getting divorced when you were 4 years old, or if your father was an alcoholic, or if your mother was depressed, or if you just had to go to school and you were freaked out because the other kids were making fun of you, like those little but super meaningful, difficult things that happen when we're young. We call them relational developmental or little t traumas. And the tendency, as the Buddha pointed out, is to look away from those things. We want to pretend they didn't exist. We want to be normal. We want to try to just like fit in. But the underlying anxieties, fears, shame, the underlying feelings that come from those kinds of situations tend to lurk. They tend to, like hang out somewhere in our bodies or in our unconscious. And then, like in post-traumatic stress, they come out in our intimate relationships, in our family, really, when we're taking an exam in school, and think we're going to fail, whatever. So both the Buddhist psychologists and the Western psychotherapists have found that training yourself to face that which you would rather ignore, it can be healing for trauma.